Now turning to the White House, where a 73-year-old legal statute is being used to defend the Trump administration's immigration crackdown. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952 was passed amid anti-communist fears during the early Cold War. Now, that period of history is the focus of the new book, Red Scare: Blacklist, McCarthyism, and the Making of Modern America. Author and reporter Clay Ryson joins Hari Srinivasan to discuss what past political hysteria tells us about the present.
Bianna, thanks. Clay Ryson, thanks so much for joining us. First, I guess for our audience that might not have paid attention in history class, the Red Scare, why did it happen? What was it? Just set the table for us.
Yeah, so the Red Scare was a period from roughly the end of World War II, 1946, went for about a decade, 1957, although it's hard to put dates on these things. But it was a period of rampant, sort of unchecked anti-communist hysteria. There was a real reason for it. Look, there was Soviet espionage in the United States. There was the Cold War, obviously, but it got out of hand in a pretty dangerous way and scary way, where even teachers and postal workers were being called into question for their loyalty to America.
So what were the kind of underlying tensions that made Americans want to believe that there was going to be, well, Soviet infiltration? We were literally allies with the Soviets. And why did it turn so quickly?
Yeah, well, I think there are two reasons. One is sort of a long simmering conflict between the progressive America that came out of the New Deal, an America that was oriented more toward a pluralist vision, very much embracing of women's rights and civil rights, but also an active government. And then on the other side, a conservatism that reacted very strongly against that for a variety of reasons, some of which were pretty conspiratorial. And that simmered for a long time. The Great Depression was on, Roosevelt was popular. And then, as you said, the war started and we were allies with the Soviet Union. But pretty immediately after that, things changed dramatically so that the Soviets became our Cold War enemies. But part of that message coming from President Truman and from Congress was that this war has to be fought domestically as well, that we have an obligation to be 100% security minded. And so anyone who even has the iota of possible questions about their loyalty, they have to be excluded from eventually from society, not just from sensitive jobs, but we saw people kicked out of teaching jobs, of not giving fishing licenses because they were, suspect in some way. I mean, it got out of hand in ways that are funny or would be funny if they weren't so scary.
Yeah. So what was the kind of domino effect? I mean, it sometimes when you look back in history in hindsight, you say, well, how did these people let all of these things happen? But was there kind of an incremental increase or I should say decrease in the civil liberties? What happened?
Yeah, there absolutely was. One of the things that happened very early on is President Truman, who did not really believe in the threat of Soviet espionage as a big threat. He knew that there were spies, but he didn't think that it was a problem. And he didn't think that communists were about to take over the country. But because of that, he thought he could sort of essentially buy off FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, buy off his critics in Congress with what was termed a loyalty program, where they essentially investigated anyone who wanted a job in the federal government and anyone who worked in the federal government. But the process was very poorly constructed. And very quickly, people were being hounded for tiny little blips and anonymous tips that would come into the FBI. Ultimately, tens of thousands of people were thoroughly investigated. And this had a knock-on effect with the rest of society, because as soon as the president said, this is of such concern that we're going to check everybody, then other industries followed suit. And very importantly, a lot of political opportunists saw the moment and used this fear that was boiling up as a way to go after their enemies, to raise their own profile. Ultimately, Joe McCarthy, senator from Wisconsin, is the best example of this and lent his name to the era but
Yeah.
there were many other people like him, both before and during his reign of terror.
I wonder, this was in the living lifetimes of so many people who had just witnessed what happened in Nazi Germany, with people turning on each other, being asked and incentivized to turn in their neighbors, right? But it's like we think about that as like some sort of bygone era. We clearly read about it in the history books. But we're talking about a decade and a half or less.
Yeah, I think one of the things that is important to keep in mind when we think back from our present moment, or maybe recent past, is how fragile civil liberties are, and how willing people are to trade some civil liberties for the promise of security. And obviously Nazi Germany is an extreme example of that. But I think in America, a lot of people saw it as a trade-off. It wasn't that they were willing to give up all civil liberties, but maybe the civil liberties of some people, maybe some of their own civil liberties, because they were being told that this was this overwhelming threat, that there were communists all over the United States who were poised to take over.
The second half of the book title is The Making of Modern America. So what were the consequences? What are the kind of long-term impacts that the Red Scare had in shaping the America that we live in today?
Yeah, I think there are a couple. I mean, one is that it really put in place the left-right divide that we know today. It didn't create it. It had already been there, but it gave this sharp underline to this idea that the left is always going to be suspect for certain things that it may or may not have done, affiliation with radicalism. And it also created on the right a certain often fringe element that trafficked in conspiracy theories, was not just opposed to big government, but truly believed that the government was evil. And so while there was always, there's bipartisanship and healthy competition in the middle for decades after, there was always this undercurrent of tension and that popped up occasionally, whether it was under, the Goldwater movement or Buchanan in the 90s. So I think that's an important context. But the flip side is that we also, at least for a period, reasserted our commitment to civil liberties. Now, I think a lot of the achievements of the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s and the women's rights movement and various other pushes for equality and for civil liberties came out of the experience of the Red Scare and a commitment, at least on parts of the left, to make sure that we didn't go back to that.
Even just in reading your book, I was several times kind of surprised by how these sort of authoritarian and in some ways fascist tendencies wrap themselves in the American flag. I mean, the idea of a House Un-American Committee is so un-American that on its face, right? But you're just like, what? How did we believe that this was the key to becoming more American, is to act less like Americans?
Yeah, well, I think there's always been a strain of thinking, particularly on the right, of what Americanism is, right? And it's always debatable. It's always debated. But there is this line about a sort of purity of thought, purity of belief and association, and that the values that are inherent in the Constitution and often celebrated by many on the right, not all, but largely on the left, over dissent and over debate. These things are inherently difficult for some people to wrap their heads around when they have that kind of narrow commitment to Americanism. And so you find situations throughout modern American history when that perspective, that idea that there is one line to walk in terms of what Americanism is, when that's empowered, it becomes very easy to decide who stands outside from that.
A lot of people are looking at this book now and say, wow, it's an interesting history book, and they're finding it relevant in different ways with what's happening today. And I wonder if that is too much of a stretch, if they're right to be concerned and see these parallels. Are we projecting what we want on and want to use the word McCarthyism? What are some of the things that you've seen in the last month and a half or so that you might feel like, okay, this is an appropriate analogy, this is a reasonable parallel that we should be concerned about?
Every day I wake up and there is a news story that reminds me of something from that era from my book. And I hear from readers a lot. The book was not intended to be that way. None of this was, I don't have a crystal ball. I wouldn't be writing books if I did. But there are so many parallels, and some of them are superficial. Some of them are people deploying McCarthyite tactics here and there, which people have done for a long time. McCarthy showed what worked.
So give me an example of that.
Well, so for example, I mean, just last year, Senator Vance, when he was senator, during the debate the sort of witch hunt around Haitian immigrants, refugees in Ohio who are supposedly eating dogs. And he was challenged with evidence showing that that was not true. And he said, well, it doesn't really, and I'm paraphrasing, he said, it doesn't really matter whether this or that accusation is true. The larger point is true, which is that immigration is a problem for the United States. And so, all of these falsehoods are in service of a higher truth. And that was an argument that McCarthy used all the time and his defenders used. He would say, well, maybe I got this accusation wrong against this person, but it's still true that there are communists in the government. And so I'm making mistakes, but I'm trying to get to the truth. And that's very dangerous, right? Because of course he never did find communists, but people let him do this because he claimed to be fighting for some higher truth. Now, but a lot of people use that tactic. I'm reminded, right now we have this issue, or at least in the legal community, you have a lot of large firms that are very worried about, defending clients who are accused of this or that by the Trump administration. They're afraid of speaking out. That happened all over the place during the Red Scare. Lawyers were very hard to find. If you were accused of being disloyal to the United States or accused of being a security risk, you could not just turn to your lawyer. You could not just go to any large firm. There were very few people who were willing to stand up and say, I will defend you. I will take this on, for the same reasons. They were afraid of losing clients. They were afraid of earning the attention of guys like Joe McCarthy.
So I wonder if there were turning points that you can identify now with the benefit of history that said, okay, this moment started to turn the tide, and then these two other moments really helped.
Yeah, I think, look, geopolitics had a big part to play. Joseph Stalin died in 1953, the same year the Korean War ended. The Cold War kind of, if it was simmering, it kind of went back to just being, a little calmer. And so people were willing, Americans could kind of relax a little bit. But it also mattered that throughout the Red Scare, people stood up. Not everybody, and oftentimes with great consequence. But the Hollywood 10 stood up to the House Un-American Activities Committee and went to jail for it. Dozens of other Americans did the same thing and went to jail. But it mattered over time that people stood up. Edward R. Murrow stood up to Joe McCarthy and very famously produced a documentary, a 30-minute show that helped tank McCarthy's popularity, showing that he was a bully and that there was nothing else there to him except that. Earl Warren, the Supreme Court justice, drove the court to systematically dismantle elements of the Red Scare, the tools, the architecture of the Red Scare. And while all of these didn't happen at the same time, it took time, it eventually helped remove the threat, sort of lower the fear. Yeah. And look, the House Un-American Activities Committee was around for a long time after that. Red baiting was a tactic throughout the 1960s, and I'd say continues to be today. But the fear was removed. And I think it took all of those different actors willing to stand up for it to finally come to an end.
So I wonder if, I'm a media nerd, probably like yourself as well, but is there the possibility of an Edward R. Murrow today, given that the landscape is so fragmented? Is there a moment that's possible, or individuals like that can have that kind of an impact, given that we live in these sort of filters and these our own ecosystems of consumption?
I think there is, but with this explanation, what Murrow understood was that McCarthy was a newspaper guy. McCarthy succeeded because he understood how the newspaper ecosystem worked. He understood that if he got a scoop to a journalist right before deadline, he could basically say anything he wanted because that journalist was going to essentially reprint it without checking it. But people never saw him live, or they never saw him in action. They always saw him, maybe a photograph, usually text. Murrow understood that TV would be different, that TV was something where he could just, and if you watch that documentary, it's phenomenal because it's basically just long clips of McCarthy without much commentary from Murrow. And essentially Murrow is saying, see, this is the guy. This is the person who has us all in thrall and fear. And doesn't he look like a bully? And it worked. So the analogy today is not one-to-one. But I think what I'd say is that if someone's going to come along and be that Edward R. Murrow, it's going to be someone who fundamentally understands the media ecosystem of today. And maybe it's not a journalist. Maybe it's an influencer. Maybe it's a politician. Maybe it's just someone who has something to say and it goes viral. It's hard to know, but I think that's what it's going to be. It's going to be someone who gets the moment in a way that nobody else does.
Seeing what you're seeing now and researching what you've researched, are you optimistic, pessimistic? Kind of where are you on seeing parts of history repeat itself?
I mean, I can look back optimistically and say, I see all these similarities between then and now. And I can also say, well, it ended. And it ended in part because the American people decided in a very, I mean, that's reductive, but, you know, eventually we came to our senses and said that civil liberties abuses are ridiculous. There's no communist threat. And you can see points in American history where this has happened. And so one could say, well, the present moment will chill out and damage will be done, but we'll get over it. This was Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower's fundamental belief is that Americans are pragmatic. They're not given to demagogues for a long period of time. So I can say that optimistically. Pessimistically, I can look at all the differences between, and I think this is one of the things that history is really important for. People look for parallels, but they also need to look for differences to say, here's why today is different than things we've experienced in the past. And I hope people who read the book will go through it and say, but now it's like this. Now the challenge to the legal community is coming from the president himself, and that changes the game. And that leaves me less optimistic, simply because I don't know how this ends. And I don't know if the will of the people will even matter when push comes to shove.
The book is called Red Scare, Blacklists, McCarthyism, and the Making of Modern America. Author Clay Risen. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.